Hi, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm going to lead this tour today of the north neighborhood of Battery Park City. The thing that I want to establish as the overarching theme for this walk in the north neighborhood is the slow process of change, but also the change of scale in the north neighborhood as it was actually built out. So you saw the original master plan. You can see in this 1994 article from the New York Times a kind of snapshot of how much of the city of Battery Park City had not been completed yet, right? They're just empty lots awaiting a developer to, taste the market, be tempted to bid on that parcel and to put the future residential buildings, the apartment buildings that were always the use that was envisioned for the north and south neighborhoods. So we're going to see in the visual aids how long it took for that vision to actually take root in the sand, than the landfill that was Battery Park City. But if you can get this in your mind for 1994, what we're going to walk through today is, and here's the update in 2006 of how many of the buildings were either constructed or going to be constructed, so that you can see that all of these lots have been filled in. The buildings that changed from the original vision to a contemporary reflection of the economy, different ideas about urban planning that evolved from the first master plans of 1979 to the build out around 2000, just before 2000 started up, then set back by 9/11, and then finally realized within the last just several years of completing every single lot as originally envisioned as the development opportunity of this brand new land that was Battery Park City. And if you didn't go on any of the previous tours, I can show you in images just how much it changed and how it changed, because here is the excavation of the World Trade Center's bathtub is going to go in that site. You see the coffer-dam that goes into the water, replacing the piers that you can see over there. Formerly the bulkhead and the pier head are the two ends of the piers, and this line in the water is where the piers used to extend to. So that was, in effect, kind of the property line that was allowed. Not allowed anymore, because in 1969 they passed the Clean Water Act, and you're not allowed to dump landfill in rivers anymore, right? So that's against the law. So this was the last gasp of these large-scale urban planning initiatives like the World Trade Center, a government-initiated, right, and a government-advanced plan in terms of the power of the state being able to gather all that land or create all that land. So it's really government that made these plans happen, but it's the business community that materialized them in the process of the cycles of construction, the boom and the bust of residential markets and commercial markets. So you're seeing the government's plan being materialized in landfill. Some additional views of how they dumped the sand originally from the excavation of the World Trade Center site into the adjacent water, but then they brought landfill from all over in order to complete the 92 acres. 92 acres in New York City, Manhattan, is a lot of land, right? There it is, as just a plateau of sand, flat landfill, needed to be turned into not just topsoil for trees, but infrastructure of electricity and plumbing and roads and all of the other things that cost a lot of money. And the money was raised by bonds, and then the bonds are paid off by the future residential community. So it's a pilot fund, a payment in lieu of taxes arrangement that you're hearing a lot about these days with Penn Station master plans. So just some more photographs to get the site in this case, 1981. You can see that they have big signs and they have big dreams, but they haven't accomplished very much in getting the development community to buy into their vision yet. So what you're seeing here, I love this photograph. One of my interns found it. In 1979, this is the anti-nuclear rally and concert that apparently 200,000 people came to. There are 200,000 people over here. And part of this was the idea of bringing people to the waterfront so they could discover it, because you had never been able to come here before. In fact, there were, chain link fences that were keeping people from the water. So these had to be organized. There were other art projects that were organized, like art on the beach. These people are just enjoying the beach, but there were also art projects, sculptors and all, where you see the Titans of the World Trade Center in the background. You can see in this photograph in color just how much landfill it took and how it took a long time to settle in with the grading and everything. So just what a phenomenal Herculean task it was in order to create the land on which these parks would be developed and the apartment houses would be built. So I guess those are the main historical images, but just again to underscore what we want to look at, what wasn't accomplished in 1994, we had finished the commercial core, so the World Financial Center was done. Stuyvesant High School, which is in the far north end, we'll point to that. That was the lone pioneer in an absolutely barren strip of nothingness awaiting a future neighborhood. And as we walk through this neighborhood, we'll go like up hills and down dales, and you'll remember that the picture of the sand is, flat as a pancake. So all of this is a kind of created, invented landscape. So what had been built in terms of residential, and when we go out that way, you'll see the very first set of 3 buildings that were the first residential buildings built by Richard Lefrak of Lefrak organization of developers who did kind of middle income housing in large kind of urban renewal-ish looking utilitarian identical blocks that were characteristic of what he did. And these Southgate Towers look a little bit like that too. But they preceded the master plan by Cooper Exton, which is the one that I showed you here before. And this kind of little village of buildings, because you can see how there's a lot of variety in shapes and sizes. That variety is all pre-designed by the master plan. It was prescribed by the Battery Park City Authority. They told the developer how many square feet you could build on the site, how many stories there could be. They even told them what the materials would be: brick, 2 colors of brick, and windows. That's was the full palette. So there was a master plan in terms of the flat planning of the land and the streets. There was also a master plan in terms of the 3-dimensional character of the city and even the materiality of the buildings, which is all prescribed and had to be followed by contract with the developers. So this little villagey looking scale with lots of different shapes and sizes is mostly 8-story or 12-story, and there's maybe like one 20-story tower that takes advantage, is closest to the river and takes advantage of the views. But you can see that when the section that we're going to walk through now has been developed, the individual buildings are all bigger, they're taller, which presented a challenge to the interior space of a kind of squeezed lot that was in the shadow a great deal of the time. And we're going to walk through what really one of the delights of Battery Park City, Teardrop Park, which was designed by the landscape architects Michael van Valkenburg and associates. And you'll see how his concept for that park uses the constricted space to create a kind of compacted Central Park, a kind of, like you took Central Park and you squeezed it in on every side in a compactor, you kind of end up with Teardrop Park. So there's really a lot of variety and invention in the kind of second phase of development that you can see here in color that happens in Battery Park. There was a pivot from the original Cooper exit plan. So that's the character that we're going to be looking at today as we begin to walk through, and we're going to walk out that way. So from here we catch a glimpse of the water. We can see over to the Lackawanna terminal, the ferry terminal that would bring either people or also cargo when it came across the river from the American continent to Manhattan Island. You can see down to Ellis Island there, and farther, you can't really see her from here, but the Statue of Liberty, which is certainly from the South neighborhood, a point of homage and a constant presence. These rather utilitarian slabs are the Lefrak Projects, and they date to about 1984 or so. They are still kind of middle-ish income. They're the most affordable places to live in Battery Park City, rental. And I think we can see here the Winter Garden from the outside, so the big glazed space. Because it was the focus of our last tour, I didn't really call attention while you were standing there under the palm trees at the great vaulted space, really beautiful space that is the kind of condenser, a mixer of the four towers that come together in the commercial center. And I suppose like any American mall, we've been enjoying the air conditioning inside of the climatized glass space that now we're going to go out into the heat and humidity. But you can see as we do go out this side, take a look at the facade treatment of these individual buildings, and I'm going to point down to the telephone building from the 1920s, the great Art Deco building by Ralph Walker, so that you can see the similarity in the early American modern of the 1920s, whether you call it Art Deco or modern, whatever, this setback style, but a wall and a window, a punch window. So a window and a wall kind of patterning that you see very clearly, as well as the setback in Caesar Pelle's suite of four related buildings. So you see the 1920s Setback Skyscrapers. The telephone building was actually a kind of factory of production at the bottom because it was full of switching machinery and operators that plugged your connectors into a great switchboard and had offices above. But you can see that the way the building kind of pyramids up, which is actually a mandatory feature of New York's 1916 zoning law that established a kind of plane of light that to protect the light of the street. So the building set back in regular kind of stacked smaller boxes. And so that language of form you can see right above us in Caesar Pelle's postmodern buildings, right? So the 1980s is a period when stylistically, now this is you'd have to say neo-modernism, but all these modern buildings, which are all glass, curtain walls, so a stretched skin, very thin membrane of glass that visually connects inside and outside when you're inside the building and gives you a complete transparent wall. That's a totally different sensibility, but it's also a totally different technology of the era of the 1920s when windows opened and closed like that in order to ventilate, and workspaces depended principally on daylight to illuminate the workplace. So this window in a wall, which you see in here as an aesthetic choice with postmodernism, is clearly a reference not just to that building, but to that kind of building, that era of building. So these kinds of stepped forms as I pointed out in the last tour, the difference between that taut wall and these punch windows, where the windows are used as a pattern, and you can see the pattern changes from a majority of stone veneer on the facade below, and then turns to mostly windows above. So they're interesting stylistic and kind of period characteristics that you can see in these buildings for postmodernism, but right here across the street and in other directions you can see the whole history of where the skyscraper came from and what he was quoting. I'm just going to point to this little canopy, which was actually a later addition to the Goldman Sachs building that you see rising above, and the design vocabulary, maybe not very interesting, but the consistent red brick and kind of limited areas of glass that the Battery Park City Authority imposes on most of the people who built. They weren't able to impose too much on Goldman Sachs. Nobody really can, I guess. But the little street that goes in between, that's all pedestrian, is bridged over by a canopy. And this is one of the features that we're going to talk about, the kind of scaling down, because when I said, that the south neighborhood that was more like a village, and looks petite compared to the rest of Battery Park City. This is another way of kind of focusing on the street experience, of squeezing the pedestrians into a space so that you're creating a kind of energy that is, you see, totally different there than it is inside of the climatized shopping mall of now Brookfield Place. And there's the Shake Shack and the pizza place and everything down there too. So it's supposed to be more like neighborhood friendly. Okay, so walking in the shade, let's go towards the Irish Hunger Memorial. So there's Stuyvesant High School, straight down there. It doesn't look very far. It's actually 4 blocks or so. And as long as I'm mentioning postmodernism, and you can see it better from here, the contrast of World Financial Center, but another the S. Pelly building, KPF is another New York architect, and you see the building that rises above and is actually in Tribeca, not in Battery Park City. So what looks like it's just behind Stuyvesant was actually back office spaces for Merrill Lynch, and then Travelers Insurance or somebody bought it for their whole headquarters. But that's a postmodern building too, right? So the contrast between a kind of quotation of historical forms like the little temple that you see on the top of it and the predominance of kind of stony facade, those are characteristics. And Battery Park City has many features of postmodernism, though we don't think of it stylistically as that, but I'm going to point out things that I think relate to the architectural theories and sensibilities of the time. Now, so this is the North End Avenue that I was talking about, and you can see the consistent character of the red brick and the kind of street wall that is consistent, that limits the area of the glass. So having less glass, less fenestration isn't all that attractive to the people who are going to buy apartments. They would rather have great big windows, but this is something that is really a really key decision at the beginning of Battery Park City and the master plan, and gives it the conformity or the harmony, however you want to characterize it, that makes you know that you're in a place that had a grand design, right? And they implemented that. Even though I'm going to stress some of the changes that happened along the way, the overall harmony of the architecture was absolutely by design. Okay, so wait till he goes back. The Irish Hunger Memorial, which was won in competition by Brian Toll, the architect, and his associates, I think they're called 1,100 associates, is a plot of land that was set aside as a park by the Battery Park City Authority. It's adjacent to the little fountain that you can see there, and we're not going to walk that well. Maybe we'll walk almost not to the water, but we'll walk around the outside of this River Terrace building, which is the last of the residential buildings to be added in this north neighborhood, but overall. And you can see that it looks a little less kind of classicizing in its language than some of the other ones that we'll look at. And I think they got to press the envelope a little bit with the Battery Park City Authority. So there's more glass. But look how big this building is. It almost looks like the scale of the World Financial Center, right? So there were plenty of adjustments along the way. Because one of the things that we won't walk through, but we'll talk about, is the ball yards, the baseball and the soccer fields and everything that's just on the other side of those buildings. And once there became a resident community of Battery Park City to voice their opinion, they would say, and it's a very family-oriented demographic here, so they would say, we need more places for the kids to play. The parks were great, but they wanted to be able to play soccer and baseball and football. So once those were no longer building sites, you had to figure out how the revenue from the now not residential buildings was going to help pay for the overall economics of Battery Park City. So the buildings at this end got bigger because of that. Oh, everything. Absolutely everything is landfill. This was water. Okay. And you can note as we go along here, these are sad quotations because this is not just the Irish who died of hunger in the potato famine and emigrated to the U.S. It's a world memorial site against hunger, to fight hunger. Okay, so on this hot and steamy day, we get, New Jersey is behind this kind of impressionist haze, but you can see the glint in the water and how beautifully broad the Hudson is here. You can see how close it is, and you can see the glory of Battery Park City, the esplanade that continues all the way around the north neighborhood, all the way down to our south neighborhood and Wagner Park. You see, passing the little playground, how little kids are there with their nannies and moms and having a wonderful time on all the play toys. It's a very different kind of park than the one that we're going to be going into now, which is Teardrop Park, which was designed for kids. At least that was the brief and the description of the landscape architects. But we'll see how many people we actually see occupying Teardrop Park. It seems much more private. In fact, a lot of people don't even know about it because it's tucked in there in between buildings. So these are very public, and maybe if you weren't from Battery Park, you might, you would know about this, and it's really for everyone. But we're gonna enter there through the trees and wind our way across, up and down through 2 blocks of Teardrop Park. Before we go in there, be sure to look up at this building, which is Raphael Pelly of Clark Pelly's Solaire. So right after 9/11, so in I guess late 2001, they did have the groundbreaking for this project, and we won't go into the setback that the World Trade Center site posed for everybody, and certainly the residents of Battery Park City that were downwind of the dust, and the World Financial Center was crashed. The glass was crashed in at one end and completely destroyed. Parts of the building were destroyed with the fall of the towers. And Battery Park City was a cordoned off zone, so people had to be evacuated, and they couldn't come back until the site was enough decontaminated for something like 3 months, and sometimes even longer than that. So the fact that this building kind of went into the ground and realized the plans that had just been afoot in 2000 is pretty miraculous. It was finished in 2003, and it's the first LEED certified, so Green Building Guidelines, a first LEED certified residential building in New York or anywhere. And the reason it is that is because the Battery Park City Authority imposed mandatory green guidelines in 2000. So every building here has to follow has to measure up to those guidelines. And most of the guidelines are relevant to the interior spaces. So the way you use water, don't waste water, maybe recycle gray water, capture rainwater, clean and filter the air. So it's kind of the internal healthy environment that is the primary focus. But there are also things about sourcing the materials within a 500-mile radius, and a whole checklist of things that make you green guidelines. And so this is the first building that follows those, and then all of the others do. There are other ones here. That one by the Verdesian by Pelley Clark Pelley. Also, there's some by Robert A.M. Stern Associates, RAMSA. A range of architects. So now we're going to walk into Teardrop. You can see how secluded these little play areas are. You see the big slide. There are a lot of places for kids to have a lot of fun. It seems like they're not quite as much fun as elephants and hippopotamuses with water coming out of their noses the way they were back in the larger park. But it's frequented. But one thing you notice here, I certainly do, is that it's shady now, right? This time of the day. So there's a much more secluded and kind of private atmosphere to it. Okay, so our alternate route would have been to go, I think there was a fence there on the other side, threw me off, but we would have climbed up to the hill and then down a series of stairs that would have taken us through this shaded area and through the wall, because this is just like a kind of cliff that is penetrated by a tunnel. This is an art piece by the artist Ann Hamilton, who was paying homage to Frederick Law Olmsted, I mentioned before, and his design for Central Park, in the way that he liked to expose the topography of existing rocks, but also create these man-made tunnels like the underpasses that take the traffic underneath Central Park. So this is supposed to be a specific reference to his work. The water that comes out here, maybe it's gray water from the apartments, but you can see that it's dripping in some places as if it's some kind of natural outcropping or stream, but it's really conceived for wintertime use when the water would trickle out and a kind of ice wall would be created by the dripping water. Maybe global warming, we won't have that anymore, but in any case, it's a really lovely wall, and it does feel very evocative of Central Park to me. So let's go up here. You can see now how we're really on the backside, the backside of one set of apartments and actually the backside of both, because the North End Avenue really is the front where you enter with the doorman and everything. So we'll stay here in the shade, but this doesn't look like so much because it's under construction here today, but quite a few years ago, I went on a tour that was led by by people in the firm of the landscape architects, Michael van Valkenburg. And each one of these hills, as I was mentioning before, wasn't here when it was just a flat plateau of sand. These are all an unnatural topography that's created. And in fact, they gave us a very detailed description of the angle that you could still maintain grass with runoff, not making gullies, and you'll be able to keep the grass onto the side of the hill because it's got a kind of undergirding of a netting underneath it for the root system and everything. So these are highly engineered lawns that you're looking at, no matter how naturalistic it might look. And that's supposed to be the rolling hill. So if you're a kid, you get to the top and you just roll down like that. So these have ascribed and well studied by the playground designers, uses that they imagined that kids would like to use. Maybe this is a good point to talk about changes in the Battery Park City community, but also a major civic engagement project that they have underway now. This is the last leg of their resiliency plan, and the first phase of it is, unfortunately, across the street from the Skyscraper Museum, where Wagner Park is going to be excavated as of after Labor Day, so that the existing gardens are dug up. Then they're going to dump more landfill, regrade, make a new elevated park behind a 10-foot seawall that will separate, hopefully, the storm surge from the next worse than Sandy superstorm, and prevent that from coming in our front door and a lot of other people's front doors. So that resiliency project, which I have an article about that I'll reference in case you want to go read. This is hot off the press, because I think it was published at 11:18 this morning in Bloomberg. So you can read about the resiliency plan and see a lot of the images. Now, these are all the neighborhood that, and there are plenty of these signs if you walk through the gardens in the South End that are color renderings of what this is going to look like. So the only phase of the resiliency plan that has been set is the South neighborhood, and they're still in the process of presenting initial plans, actually initial options for plans to the community in order to get feedback. So there's a lot of engagement that they are both obliged to do and that they want to do in order to create the buy-in of the community. And there's probably the most controversial thing is the major change to the little pavilion that was designed by Machado and Silvetti, that is the existing brick pavilion, little archaic ruin in Wagner Park, and it'll be much larger when they redesign it, and it has these kind of vaulted spaces, and it will be also a part of the seawall that prevents a storm surge from coming up and over Battery Park City. We were saved, the Skyscraper Museum had water all but 8 feet from our front door, and we're just a little bit higher than most places. In fact, we're a little bit higher than the back door, because water came over the Battery and went up West Street and came back around the Little West Street into the basement of our building, where all the transformers were submerged in salt water, and we lost the power for 11 days and telephone lines for a very, very long time. So it's a serious issue that needs to be addressed. And Battery Park City Authority has the money and the power in the sense that money has power, but also they have the authority to be able to implement plans in a way that doesn't require the same kind of review process that working within the city with either a zoning change or a land use change is required. So in a way, we're the first experiment of a piece of a resiliency plan, which has been long discussed and very, very long to implement. So we'll see. But to credit Battery Park City for its vision with sustainability, resiliency, but especially green building guidelines, is more than 20 years old, and these buildings are the testament to their kind of swallow hard and hope for the best, and their ability to hold on to find out if the market would agree to embrace mandatory green guidelines, because you had to buy into that in order to build. As a developer, to develop a site, you had to follow those rules. And so the extra increment of expense is something like 5 to 15% back in the day, that these were really novel technologies. So it really, they were taking a chance that the developers would just give a pass to the whole idea. And it mattered enormously that the revenue stream is created by the rents of these buildings that pay in lieu of taxes, because they don't own the land here. They pay for the lease of the developer pays for the lease of the land. So the rents pay the developers, and the developer can pay Battery Park City. So Battery Park City can throw off some funds to give back to the city of New York, who said, okay, we'll let you build this thing, back in 1969 and 1979. So it's a long horizon kind of plan that is all built up against the faith the government will stand behind the debt, the bonds that were written and sold in order to pay for the infrastructure and everything and the parks of Battery Park City. Let's go this way because we'll go to the little pavilion. We're going to wrap up here as our last stop, but you can see that we are within viewing distance of the water inlet that marks the very end of the Battery Park City's 92 acres, right? So we're almost to the north end. We can see the water. We can, see the infants learning to walk and the squirrels running across the pavers. A combination of park and city, I suppose, is what Battery Park City hopes that this would eventually be, and a public access to the waterfront and to parks that is wholly open and democratic. So that's what I would call the kind of 1960s version of ambition to dream on that scale. But it's realized, as I was just explaining, through a public-private partnership, which is absolutely typical of the 1980s and forward, what academics today like to call, neoliberalism, but, whether it's corporations working together with government, but the idea that you use the engine of private enterprise and development in order to realize plans in partnership with the vision, whatever the kind of initial vision or the power of the state in order to implement plans, and the economic power of bonding against future values. So that's the way the Battery Park City was realized. It would still be a plateau of flat sand if it didn't find the developers who would erect the apartments, rentals, condos. An increment of affordable housing was incorporated in the plans from the very beginning, but it's really the demographic of Battery Park City is upper middle class and higher. I think the average household median income is something like $170,000, which is like 3 times as much as the city of New York generally. So it's an affluent community. It's moderately diverse. White and Asian in equal parts are the great majority, something like 78% of the population. So really large numbers. But I think you see with the people who are using the space, it is very diverse. It's certainly what I see when I ride my bike through here and pass by. Usually on my commute rather than in leisure. So here we are underneath this lovely little pavilion, which is a classical building, and it is a classic example of postmodernism. It's by an architect who was a professor at Princeton and various other places, Dimitri Porphyrios. So it has Greek origins, I suppose, both in architecture and in the nationality of its architects. And you can see that it makes reference to classical columns and even before that to the wood columns that were in the 1980s where they thought architecture schools talked about the primitive hut. So the first architecture was like 4 trees and some bowers and leaves that are piled for shelter. And that idea of what are the origins of architecture? The primitive hut is evoked in the wood columns, and then we kind of raise up to a kind of formal architecture of a podium and the columns, but here made of brick, so Roman, not Greek, and the simple capitals, and then the wood roof are meant to be both simple but also deep, kind of poetic in the reference to the origins of architecture and the kind of ideal of architecture to speak across time and to be set in nature the way it is here at the edge of the park. So I love this little pavilion because it seems to me to really kind of anchor Battery Park City in its moment in architectural and academic theory, because it played out, whether it was in the master plans of Cooper and Exted or the people that oversaw the projects of the master planning. They all of these ideas were much discussed in the academy at the time, and then these little kind of moments or incidents in the plan where the idea of incorporating art into the overall landscape was really key. Also, this kind of little pavilion is like an English garden of the 18th century, right, of the Enlightenment, where you're walking through an English landscape, kind of curving serpentine paths, and you come across what was called a folly at the time, and this is very indicative of that. So, so Battery Park City is really a place in time that the farther we get away from it really looks to be of its moment, which is a moment in the 1980s in particular of postmodernism, and an idea about contextual architecture, and an idea about the city, because this context in the master plan after 1979, the second iteration of it, which even before the Green Guidelines, began to want to reference Tribeca and to see the neighborhood not of the World Trade Center and its extreme, austere, upright modernism, but the more kind of contextual, heterogeneous is the word I was looking for, the more heterogeneous character of a place that's grown up over time, like Tribeca. So everything about Battery Park City marks it of these ideals, kind of academic ideals that from which the time which was born.